Thank you. You may be seated.
Good morning.
Good morning, Roger. Good morning, Roger.
Okay, Mr. Murdaugh. Murdaugh. Continuing on, the case of State v. Alex Murdaugh, Mr. Waters.
Thank you, Your Honor, and may it please the Court.
Yes, sir.
Your Honor is aware, of course, that as we showed up for a pretrial hearing for a trial that will be going this week for the set of financial crimes as it related to the Satterfields, ultimately the parties agreed to a plea agreement to resolve the various financial crimes against Mr. Murdaugh in return for a negotiated sentence of 27 years in prison, that being 85% time that would have to be served before the possibility of any release. And obviously those are independent of the two existing life without parole sentences currently Mr. Murdaugh is serving for the murders of his wife and son. At that time, because that plea negotiation developed during the course of pretrial hearings, we deferred final acceptance of that negotiated plea until here today so that all the victims could be properly notified and be present and address the court if they so desired. And we have notified all the financial victims of the various indictments against Alec, and those who wanted to attend are either here or their representatives are here and will address the court at the appropriate time. But, Your Honor, I think it's important because we ultimately did the factual basis sort of on the fly, and I did go into great detail. But I said at that time that I wanted to spend a little bit more time sort of laying the table, setting the table, and putting a little bit more meat on the bones since we are here post-Thanksgiving about the nature of the schemes that Alec Murdaugh conducted. And I will kind of walk through those to not only reset the plea agreement, but also to provide, Your Honor, some of the paperwork so you can see how this scheme ultimately went down. One of the things I would say again is that this is a negotiated plea, and as Your Honor is well aware, what that means is, of course, is that Your Honor, after hearing everything, of course, will, and that includes hearing from the defense and the victims, would either accept the 27 years or reject it, depending on, obviously, Your Honor's view of all that information. But, Your Honor, to begin with this whole morass, again, I think the easiest way for me to walk back through it would be to go in chronological order and to, again, talk about not only the counts that are being pled to and what's being pled to, but also kind of remind Your Honor of the facts. And I do have some exhibits that I'm going to hand up to Your Honor as we move through this, and I've, of course, already provided copies to the defense.
Prior to proceeding, Mr. Harpootlian, do you have any introductory comments?
Your Honor, only to note that at a juncture after Mr. Waters finishes, we're going to hear from the victims, and I'm told this morning some of their lawyers. My concern is that the Victims' Bill of Rights guarantees the victims the ability to make a presentation. I have no problem with that whatsoever. There's going to be, I'm sure, extensive comments by them. But I'm concerned from what I read in social media about some of the lawyers making comments today. Some of them are they're going to express anger against me and Mr. Griffin and Mr. Murdaugh. Some of them are nakedly using this as an infomercial to sell coffee cups or T-shirts or bobbleheads in an effort to maximize their economic return on this process. I would ask the court either to have the victim speak or the attorneys, but not both, And if the attorneys do speak, they address their comments to you and not to us, and their comments should exhibit the demeanor of this courtroom, not some sort of marketing ploy. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Harpootlian, and certainly we will maintain the civility and proper decorum of the court. The parties are entitled, victims are entitled to representation, and the lawyers can speak on the victim's behalf, addressing the court and not addressing counsel. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. And again, just to kind of set the table, we all know through this entire process, through the murder trial, through my comments from the initial proceeding we had at this plea, of the power and the influence and the family legacy that was exercised, that was so important to Alex Murdaugh, and the trust that his family name and that law license on the wall had in that community and in the state in its entirety. And with the staff at the firm and with the people at the bank. And there were so many individuals that were trusting of Alex Murdaugh, and that is how this decade-long scheme was able to take place. And ultimately, we had people who came to Mr. Murdaugh for help, people that he told he was going to help, and in many instances, there was significant funds that Mr. Murdaugh paid to those individuals. But that was how the scheme usually worked. It was a sleight of hand. It was where he was handing them a check and had their focus on that he was able to steal money from them behind their back. It was the fact that he used things like Palmetto State Bank and what we've called the fake forge on these disbursement sheets and told his staff to fill those out. And then those go to the finance office at the firm. And it looks legitimate. And your average staff member who is going to never question a powerful senior partner, but these look like legitimate expenditures. And so that was that trust, that power, that influence, that was the only way that these schemes were able to take place. And throughout this investigation, Your Honor, and this ultimately, when we first got involved, the state grand jury first got involved, it was late August of 2021, and I described it before as leading to a whirlwind state grand jury investigation because the side of the road happened not long after that, and we realized that we needed to devote a lot of resources to figuring out what's going on here, because something certainly was rotten there and we needed to explore it. And that's one of the things that, along with investigating the murders, that we focused on. And I want to say this, I'm obviously standing here as a representative of the Attorney General's Office of Attorney General Alan Wilson, and obviously Attorney General Wilson, I'm standing here in his shoes. He's obviously been heavily involved in this case as well. You saw him at the murder trial. And we've come to this result for a lot of reasons. And the reasons are, and the main reason is that, first of all, we have these admissions from Alex Murdaugh that he committed all these crimes. We're able to detail those for Your Honor and frankly for the world, because it's important that the South Carolina judicial system have accountability for those that abuse it, and it's important that we explore the manner in which it was done in some detail so we can see how easy it was for power and influence and trust to be used to steal millions of dollars for years and years. Obviously, as we began that state grand jury investigation with our partners at SLED, and I have a number of SLED agents that worked so hard on this case and on the murder case that are sitting out there that were instrumental as we started to develop this case and worked so very hard. But I want to say this as well, is that as we started to go through this morass of documents and financial documents and bank statements and checks, and again, I have a lot of the state grand jury staff sitting here. I've mentioned my co-counsel Johnny James and our forensic accountant Carson Burney a couple of times, who are also very instrumental in those early days in going through those. And we worked very hard. But I do have to say that we received a lot of cooperation through that process from the very early days, from the first grand jury testimony back in October and November of 2021. We received a lot of cooperation from the firm formerly known as PMPED. They had provided their staff members, their financial people who had done a lot of review themselves. The lawyers in the firm had done a lot of review, and they were able to provide us some of those documents that started this investigation, that gave us breadcrumbs that we were able to follow. And so they've been cooperative throughout that process. Similarly, Palmetto State Bank. Your Honor is, of course, aware that we've indicted Russell Lafitte, who has yet to be tried and therefore is presumed innocent until found guilty. But the bank, who was also in many respects in those early schemes, conversion of those Palmetto State Bank checks was how this scheme took place. And the bank similarly has been very cooperative in doing its own investigation, but also in providing access to documents and providing access to bank staff, and some of whom you saw testify at the financial trial and at the federal trial of Mr. Lafitte. So those entities have been cooperative to us through this process, but ultimately, and I described this before, but I think it needs saying again, that we can talk about what the lawyers did and the Attorney General's staff did and the state grand jury did and SLED did and our other law enforcement partners did and what the firm did and the bank did as we tried to put together and be able to tell this long story of how this man was able to steal for so long from the system. But as I described before, the other people that were so crucial to that were the actual clients, the victims, and their representatives. And I described before, Your Honor, particularly in those very early days, having to sit down with those victims as we were getting started and starting to put together some of those first cases and having to look them to the eye and say, I need your help to tell your story. I need your help. We can't make change. We can't expose what's happened unless you tell your story. And I described it before, there was a palpable fear, particularly among those early victims, in coming forward because of the power, because of the influence, because of the belief that no one would ever do anything about what had been going on. And I told them that we would see this through to its conclusion, that we would be committed to it, and again, to a man or a woman, those individuals that I sat at a conference table much like this, looked them in the eye, and they ultimately agreed to come forward knowing full well their name would be out there, and they came forward knowing full well that they would have to go testify in front of the state grand jury, and they knew full well that they would have to testify. And that, Your Honor, again, was true courage, because I heard over and over again, Mr. Waters, again, you don't understand. I have to live there. You don't understand who you're messing with. But they still came forward, and that really was crucial to development of all these financial crimes, which ultimately not only exposed this long-standing scheme of how a lawyer can abuse the system, but really put in context everything else that happened through the course of Alex Murdaugh's life. Your Honor, I have what's been marked now as State's Exhibit 1 that I will hand up, and this is just a timeline of how the financial crimes developed throughout the course of this scheme. And as I described before, and again, I'm going to try to walk through this as quickly as I can, but the first thing that we had was that Alec ran into some financial trouble in 2008, 2009. We all know the recession happened. And after that, he had a number of early large recoveries. And it caused his partners and people around him, because the legitimate fees from those cases were so extensive, to believe that he ultimately had righted the ship. And he did take those legitimate fees, but he was also borrowing so much money, and he then started to steal from those large recoveries. And Your Honor, the first one that is part of the state grand jury cases is Natasha Thomas and Hakeem Pinckney. And Your Honor, there was a catastrophic accident there. It left Hakeem a paraplegic. He ultimately passed away. And Mr. Murdaugh came to the hospital to offer to represent them. One of the things that he had done was had Russell Lafitte at Palmetto State Bank appointed as a conservator. And that became crucial to this particular scheme. And ultimately, when those recoveries end up, and Your Honor, I would ask, not that first one, but this exhibit, we've redacted account numbers from it, but there is extensive financial information in there, and we would ask that these exhibits, which I think are important for Your Honor to see, but that they remain under seal this time just because they do have financial information in them.
All of them? Or just
Not the first one, but the first one.
no objection?
All right, I'm going to hand up this exhibit right there. And Your Honor, this is the exhibit as it relates to Hakeem Pinckney. And what you see on that first page and on the second page is really the hard work that was done in this case. Because it's one thing to determine that a check went from where it was supposed to be and somehow ended up in Alex Murdaugh's world. But it was another thing to figure out exactly how that money was spent and how that money was dispersed. And ultimately, you can see here on that page that when Alex Murdaugh, and this would be on December 20th, 2011, stole the $309,581.46, that when we looked and traced how that money was spent, a large portion of it went to go to pay back a personal loan from Charles Lafitte, to pay his father, to pay the Hannah Plyler conservatorship, which is another conservatorship that Alex Murdaugh had set up in a case that he had where he had Russell Lafitte named as the conservator. And then ultimately he started to have, and Russell started to lend money from that conservatorship to Alex to keep Alex afloat, to keep him afloat on those many loans that he had with Palmetto State Bank that Russell Lafitte had given him. There's another conservatorship, Malik Williams, that substantial monies went to. But Your Honor, if you flip over to the last page of that exhibit, you'll see a disbursement sheet right here. And these are very indicative of how easy it was ultimately to steal. These disbursement sheets have the recovery amount at the top. They have the various sources, the insurance companies in there. And then they have the legal fees, which tended to be anywhere from 33 to 40% of, in this instance, a very, very large recovery. Costs and expenses and loans and medical bills. And then down at the bottom, there's just a simple thing that says disbursement to client, and it has Palmetto State Bank, $309,581.46. And based on those disbursement sheets that Alex Murdaugh would cause his staff to prepare, then the finance office at the firm would have those checks cut, as they were told to do by this man right there. And once he had that check cut to Palmetto State Bank, he would take it to Russell Lafitte at the bank, and then Russell, having a check in his hand made out to Palmetto State Bank, would then convert that money to Alex's benefit in the manner in which he said. And in many instances, it was to pay back loans that Russell Lafitte had either given Alex Murdaugh to keep him afloat from the Plyler conservatorship or from other actual bank loans, to the point where Alex had gotten so much in hock to Russell Lafitte that Russell Lafitte was in hock to Alex Murdaugh. And in many instances, these loans, particularly early on, were used to stop Alex Murdaugh's financial situation from falling apart and from all of those loans going into default, much less the fact of being exposed that Mr. Lafitte and Alex together had been loaning themselves money from a conservatorship meant for the benefit of two minor girls.
Did you say in hock or?
In hock, H-O-C-K.
In hock.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Your Honor, the first one, that being the Hakeem Pinckney, that is Alex is pleading to a representative count for each victim, but that was 2022 GS 4702 count 1, breach of trust. $10,000 or more, and he's agreed to a 10-year penalty for that particular one. Your Honor, the next one that I'll hand up deals with Natasha Thomas. And this is Stage 3 for purposes of this proceeding. And this one again, Your Honor, this was she was in the same particular accident, and there were two different thefts that were taken in this particular one. One of them was on December 20th, 2011, and that was for $325,000. Again, Mr. Murdaugh had Russell Lafitte appointed as conservator for Natasha Thomas, who was a minor at the time. And if we look on the last page of this exhibit, we will see an amount down at the bottom. There's disbursements to clients, and you see the various disbursements that are going out. But the last one says Natasha Thomas, Palmetto State Bank, for $325,000. And again, the staff does as they're told by Mr. Murdaugh, and they cut that check from the trust account for $325,000 made out to Palmetto State Bank. And Alex Murdaugh is then able to convert that money, and actually converts all $325,000 of it to pay back a loan from his father. Your Honor, that is 2022 GS 4701 count 1, to which he's pleading guilty related to Natasha Thomas. That's breach of trust, $10,000 or more, and he's agreed to a 10-year sentence on that one. Your Honor, also in this particular exhibit, we have and this was very typical, that a lien was held back to pay off, in this instance, Medicaid. And it was very common for plaintiffs' lawyers, this is very common, very accepted, and very usual, to hold back, give initial disbursements to clients, but then hold back monies to pay off medical liens and other liens that need to come out of that recovery. And it's very common, again, for them to then negotiate with those medical providers or whoever else, and then, if they can, get them to accept something less than the full amount. So if they can get them to accept 70%, then what they're supposed to do is then return that additional money to their client. Hey, great news, I'm a great lawyer. I managed to settle those liens for less, and here's an additional amount of money on top of what I've already given you that you weren't expecting. But what we found, of course, was that that became a very easy delta that would allow Alex Murdaugh to steal funds. And ultimately, we see that second theft from amounts that involved Natasha Thomas. Ultimately did pay some liens, but instead of returning that money to Natasha Thomas, as Alex Murdaugh was supposed to do, instead he had another check cut to Palmetto State Bank and made out to Palmetto State Bank, took it to Russell Lafitte, and had that money converted for his own personal use, and pretty much had it converted to cash. And ultimately had it converted to cash, including $9,000 cash, which is obviously a very interesting number in that it's meant to stay under that $10,000 threshold. Your Honor, I mentioned before that he had Russell Lafitte appointed as a conservator, and they had been borrowing money from a different conservatorship. Russell had been loaning money to Alex Murdaugh from that conservatorship. Russell Lafitte had been loaning money to himself from that conservatorship, and that money needed to be paid back. And so ultimately, I'm going to hand out what's been marked as States 5. And ultimately, he had yet another huge recovery, and that involved the case of Arthur Badger, whose family was in a catastrophic accident, severely injured his children, killed his wife. And Mr. Murdaugh told him the case would only be worth a certain amount. And during the course of this, and this was very common, Mr. Badger had to get money to pay loans. He had to pay his bills. And what we found in this particular case was that Mr. Murdaugh ultimately settled globally a lot of these claims and had the civil defense lawyers there allocate the money in a certain way so that he could ultimately hand a very large check to Mr. Badger, more in line with what he was expecting him to receive. But he structured so much of the money going into Arthur Badger's sort of part of the ledger that he was able to steal $1.325 million from that particular claim. And if you look at that first page, you'll see the tracing exhibit from the state grand jury and all the work that was done there. But you can see, for example, in one instance, he paid off a credit card balance that he had with this money of over $150,000. He used this money also to pay back the conservatorship that I previously mentioned, that he was getting money loaned to him by Russell Lafitte for over $482,000. And those are just some of the expenditures that we see on this particular theft. The other thing is very interesting, is you'll see at the very back, you'll see an email, and this is from Russell Lafitte to Alex Murdaugh, and he says, "Alex, can you get Jeannie, who is the CFO at the law firm, to recut the check as follows?" And then you can see some amounts that are down below there that were cut that way. And they were cut that way so that it could break up that money, and then that money could be used to give the illusion of regular payments, to really to fuse out a huge amount, like $1.325 million, in order that slowly, over a period of time, Alex could convert that money, and again, in large measure, to pay back loans that had come to him from that prior conservatorship. And again, throughout that, there were a number of loans that were cut to Palmetto State Bank, and they were essentially cut in a manner that Russell Lafitte had Alex cut them that way, and then they were ultimately stolen all the way from February of 2013 through May of 2014. And so ultimately, it was a very involved scheme. Because it was such a large amount, they had to cut it up. They had to make it look like it was coming at different times from different sources. And that is how, over the course of that long period of time, Alex was able to steal that money through use of Palmetto State Bank. Your Honor, this is 2022 GS 4703, count 1. To which Alex is pleading to breach of trust over $10,000 and has agreed to a 10-year sentence. Next one I'll hand up to Your Honor, State's Exhibit 6. And this individual was Dion Martin. And Dion Martin was in a head-on collision with a drunk driver in 2012. He was on life support for a number of weeks, and a month after he was released, Alex Murdaugh called him and said, "I'm going to help you, I'm going to represent you," and ultimately ended up settling the case without talking to him, ultimately covered up the paper so he couldn't really see what he was getting, but ultimately, like all of these, still gave Dion Martin very, very sizable funds. But if we look at this particular one, ultimately he was able to steal on October 7th, 2015, $338,056. $338,056. There's a disbursement there. It says disbursement to Forge, and it has that very amount on there. And again, this is where we see the scheme start to change a little bit. After the Badger theft and how much detail had to be engaged in with those checks to Palmetto State Bank, with Russell Lafitte sending emails asking Alex to cut it up different ways, to have that money dispersed in different manners, that got to be very, very difficult. So what Alex Murdaugh changed his scheme, and what he did was he went to Bank of America and again opened up a account in the name of Richard Alexander Murdaugh, doing business as Forge, and ultimately was able to get those checks cut to what we call the fake Forge. And again, the staff didn't question it because the legitimate Forge Consulting, which also was very cooperative throughout this case in providing information, was a company that served as a consultant, providing services and linking plaintiffs to annuities where they could structure their settlements where they would get regular payments. And so when he could get that money make out to Forge, all he had to do was get on a disbursement sheet the word Forge, get a trust account check cut from the firm trust account made out to Forge, and then take it down to Bank of America and deposit it and convert it from there. Your Honor, that was the first theft from Mr. Dion Martin, and I'm going to return back to him in a minute. But one of the things that we see paid off from that theft of $338,000 was a $169,000 balance on a credit card. Your Honor, the next one, and I'm going in chronological order, is Johnny Bush. And I'm going to hand out what's been marked as State's Exhibit 8. I'm going to come back to Dion Martin in a minute. But this particular one was on June 9th, 2016. And Mr. Murdaugh is pleading guilty here for 2021 GS 4736, count 2, to computer crime, and he's agreeing to a 5-year sentence. And in this particular instance, Mr. Bush was a long-time friend of Mr. Murdaugh. He was in a car accident. He trusted Alexander Murdaugh. He mentioned that over and over again because Mr. Murdaugh referred to him as a brother. And anyway, Mr. Murdaugh settled the case without talking to Mr. Bush. And Mr. Bush signed the documents because, like he said, he trusted him. And ultimately, Mr. Murdaugh was able to get him to sign a disbursement sheet that had on it a disbursement to Forge for $95,000. And you can see that on the last page of this particular exhibit. And ultimately, again, that was in June of 2016 that he was able to steal that money from Mr. Bush. Going to the next one. This is Exhibit 9. And Your Honor, this particular one would be in August 11th, 2016. This is 2021 GS 4731, count 1, to which Mr. Murdaugh is pleading to breach of trust $10,000 or more and agreeing to a 10-year sentence for that particular crime. And in this particular instance, again, he had a case where there were disbursements, but he had a lien put on the disbursement sheet. The lien just said the word Forge for $70,000. And ultimately, again, he was able to take that $75,000, deposit it into his fake Forge account, and then convert it to his own use. And a lot of that was cash. A lot of that was payment to employees that he had, payment on credit cards that he had, including a payment on a credit card of over $21,000. Next one I'll hand up, Your Honor, is State's Exhibit 10. And this one is the case involving Jamie and Risher. And in this particular instance, Mr. Murdaugh is pleading to 2021 GS 4737, count 1, breach of trust $10,000 or more, to which he's agreed to a 10-year sentence. And in this instance, he had been in Iraq. His family, Mr. Risher's family, had a long connection with the Murdaughs, and he was injured. He had a younger sister who was killed. And he, because of Mr. Murdaugh's name, because of the long family association, trusted Mr. Murdaugh and went to him for help. And ultimately, Mr. Murdaugh, again, was able to get him to sign a disbursement. Actually, in this particular instance, if you look at the last page, you see that there is no signature on there for Mr. Risher. It just has Mr. Murdaugh's signature, but it has on there a disbursement to Forge for $90,000. And in many instances, that's what would happen. Sometimes Mr. Murdaugh would get the clients to sign these disbursements, and they didn't realize that those disbursements were on there that he was going to steal. Other times, the records would reflect a disbursement that was never signed by the client. But ultimately, Mr. Murdaugh gets, based on this disbursement sheet, the staff to cut a check from the trust account for $90,000 made out to Forge. He's then able to take that money, put it in his fake Forge account, and convert it to his personal use. On top of that, Mr. Murdaugh also misappropriated $5,504.94 in case expenses, which he billed to Austin Aviation for a trip to New York, a private plane service, limo service, and meals that ultimately he was able to bill to Mr. Risher as if they were legitimate case expenses for this case, when instead that was a personal trip for Mr. Murdaugh, a luxury trip, which he then billed to a client and stole that money. All right, we're going back now to Mr. Martin. I'm going to hand up State's Exhibit 7. I mentioned Dion Martin before, and now we've moved to October 11th, 2016. He had already stolen, as I said before, over $338,000 from Mr. Martin over a year earlier. But now he's back, and in this instance, he gets a check cut from Fake Forge, made out for $45,000. And again, this had been part of money that was held in trust, supposedly to satisfy liens, but Mr. Murdaugh was able to then convert that money since it remained in the trust account, and on October 11th, 2016, again, he converted that $45,000. But very interesting, Your Honor, if you look on the last page of this one related to Dion Martin on the disbursement sheet, you will see that at the top it says, under the recovery amounts, it has structured for annuity directly to Michael Gunn and has $500,000. That's a phantom recovery. That doesn't exist. He just put that number on there, and by doing so was essentially able to generate on his books $200,000 of attorney's fees. That's a phantom. It's a phantom, but it's credited him on his book. So ultimately the firm was victimized in this regard, because in the end, it works out to about $185,000 in extra year-end bonus that went to him because of that phantom recovery that was on there. Going to the next matter. We'll hand up States 11. And we're back to the Pinckney matter that I mentioned before, that catastrophic wreck. In that particular case, Mr. Murdaugh represented Hakeem Pinckney. He had his friend Corey Fleming representing Hakeem's mother, Pamela Pinckney. Because she was driving, they were allied, but she still had to be named as a defendant. And ultimately, there remained in Corey Fleming's trust account $89,133.44. And even though the disbursements had happened in that case years and years before, even though Mr. Fleming had had a lot of direct contact with Mrs. P during the course of that and had disbursed money to her, who had direct communication with her all the time, in this particular instance, without calling her, Corey Fleming and Alex Murdaugh got together, and Corey Fleming had a check cut from the MKF, the Moss Coon and Fleming trust account, for that amount. Didn't call Miss P and say, oh, by the way, there's $89,000 belonging to you. Instead, he sent that to Alex Murdaugh at the trust account, and then Alex Murdaugh, once it's in the PMPED trust account, if you look on the last page, you'll see that he gets a disbursement sheet cut. There is no signature for any client or anything like that, but gets that check cut for $89,133.44, made out to Forge, puts that in his Fake Forge account, and ultimately converts that to his personal use. And one of the things that we see on this one that's interesting, we have a $23,000 and change payment to a credit card that he used with the stolen money. We also see over $20,000 of money that he took to a check cashing service to turn into cash. Your Honor, that particular one, again, was accounted for in 2022 GS 4702, count 3, to which I previously mentioned, to which he was pleading and agreed to a 10-year sentence. Your Honor, the next one is on May 16th, 2017, and this was the first check of what we call the double dip. And this is the one where Mr. Murdaugh is pled pursuant to Alford for stealing the repayment of the firm, from the firm, of money loaned by his brother Randy, and ultimately he pled under Alford to 2022 GS 4723 count 3 to money laundering $100,000 or more, to which he's agreed to a 20-year sentence. I think it's very interesting, though, that we look at the date that first double debt check goes in, and it's May 16th, 2017, which is the same day that also we have the check cut from the PMPED trust account check for Ms. P's money for the $89,000. Those both occurred on May 16th, 2017, and ultimately were converted for his personal use. Handing up the next exhibit is Exhibit 12. And the victim in this particular case is Randy Drawdy. And again, Mr. Drawdy was in a slip and fall accident. He trusted Mr. Murdaugh because from what he heard, Mr. Murdaugh had a good reputation. Ultimately, Mr. Drawdy felt like he needed more medical treatment, but he couldn't afford it. And he did receive some disbursement, but years and years and years go by. And ultimately, in this particular one, we see here a check, and this was money that was held to pay for a potential medical bill that remained in Mr. Murdaugh's trust account for years and years. But ultimately, he had $9,569.30 on October 3rd, 2017, cut to fake forge, and then converted that money to his own use, including money to cash, to the check cashing services, and other expenditures. And ultimately, it appears that this money, again, was withheld in liens. It stayed there for a long period of time, and I'm sure at some point someone came to Mr. Murdaugh and was like, why is this money still here? And so even though it was still less than $10,000, Mr. Murdaugh ultimately converted that to his own use. And to that, he is pleading to 2021 GS 4732 count 1, breach of trust, $2,000 to $10,000, and agreeing to a 5-year sentence. Next exhibit, Your Honor, is State's Exhibit 13. And this involves Jordan Jenks. And Mr. Jenks is here present in the courtroom today. Mr. Jenks knew the Murdaughs well and considered him a friend, and ultimately said that Mr. Murdaugh pushed him to settle the case for an amount that he thought was less than what he was expecting. And he also knew that there was money that had been withheld in trust if the insurance company ever came and claimed it, was what he was told. Mr. Jenks was told by Alex Murdaugh. And he also knew that Murdaugh was busy first with the boat accident and then with the murders, and didn't want to bother him. And if we look at this particular exhibit, there was, if we look on the disbursement page, the first one, and this is 3 pages from the back, Your Honor, there was $150,000 in liens that were withheld for Blue Choice Health Plan. But instead of satisfying those liens, instead of doing right by his friend, Mr. Murdaugh instead cut one disbursement for $65,000 and another disbursement for $85,000 from that $150,000 that he had withheld, and had those made out to forge and deposited into his fake forge account. And then ultimately converted all of that to his own personal use. And you can see on the first page, the tracing exhibit, how he converted that to his personal use. Your Honor, for that particular one, he's pleading to 2021 GS 4735 count 5 to forgery for a 10-year sentence.
With regard to these various exhibits, including number 13, the disbursements to C.E. Smith, Eddie Smith, can you explain those?
Yeah, there were a lot of monies, as Your Honor has heard about, that were dispersed through Curtis Eddie Smith. And ultimately, and I'll get to that particular count, but he's pled to a conspiracy count involving the amount of money that had gone through that Mr. Murdaugh ultimately, from converted funds, then had cut to Eddie Smith, and those monies were ultimately converted for narcotics and other purposes. You can see, though, that Mr. Murdaugh would often have those checks cut to Eddie Smith using different names. There would be, and that's why you can see on the tracing exhibit, you can see that there's different mechanisms or different names in which that's listed. There's C.E. Smith, sometimes it would be Eddie Smith, sometimes it would be Curtis Smith. There were a myriad of different ways that Mr. Murdaugh would have those checks cut. Sometimes they would refer to work that was being done, that was not being done. Sometimes they would refer to auto purchases that were not happening. But ultimately, that was one of the ways in which Mr. Murdaugh was able to convert the cash that he was stealing to his own use was through routing checks through Curtis Eddie Smith. Your Honor, next exhibit I'll hand up is Stage 14. And Your Honor, this is the first of the Gloria Satterfield checks to which he is pleading guilty. And this is dated January 7th, 2019, 2021 GS 4730, count 4. He's pleading for this false pretenses and agreeing to a 10-year sentence. And there are 2 other charges he's pleading that I'll get to here in a minute. But I'm doing these in chronological order. I detailed at the prior proceeding how Gloria Satterfield was the longtime housekeeper for Mr. Murdaugh and his family. Ms. Satterfield's family, her sons trusted Mr. Murdaugh. There had been a long-time family relationship there. Ms. Satterfield, in February of 2019, not of February 2019, but Ms. Satterfield had fallen at the Murdaugh home and ultimately passed away. And Mr. Murdaugh approached the family, and some of the Satterfield family is here and is going to address the court. And he approached the family and said, I'm going to help you. I'm going to make sure that Ms. Satterfield's sons are taken care of. And ultimately, I detailed the entire timeline, which I won't go through extensively here again. But he ultimately involved his friend Corey Fleming. They got an initial recovery of $403,500. Well, that's the ultimate amount he cut to himself. It was $505,000. At that point in time, Tony Satterfield was the PR, but instead of advising Tony that the first recovery had come in, instead they involved Chad Westendorf at Palmetto State Bank, who really served as a patsy. Mr. Fleming and Mr. Murdaugh dealt with Mr. Westendorf and told him they would take care of everything, they would handle everything, they would make sure that the money went to the boys, that this money was being set up for a structure with the boys. Don't worry about communicating with the Satterfields. We've got this. But of course, the Satterfields were kept in the dark throughout the entire process. And unlike many of the other schemes where Mr. Murdaugh was able to successfully steal because he had handed a big check to these clients, so therefore they're paying attention to that life-changing money and not realizing what's really going on. In this particular instance, as I will detail, Mr. Murdaugh stole every dime of what ultimately was a very, very large recovery. And I will talk a little bit more about that. And I know I detailed that last time. I'm not going to go through the whole thing again, but suffice it to say that Mr. Murdaugh conspired with his friend Corey Fleming, who he had represent the Satterfields, to get Chad Westendorf, keep him in the dark, keep him as a patsy so that he would not really know what was going on. And ultimately, Mr. Murdaugh was able then to convert sizable portions of this money. And this is the first exhibit right here. This is the first Satterfield one. Again, this is January 9th, 2019. And this ultimately had Corey Fleming cut a check for $403,500 made out just to the single word forge. And then he was able to put that into his fake forge account and ultimately convert that to his own personal use. And what's very interesting about that is if you look on the front on the on the tracing sheet, you will see the vast majority of that money was used to pay on the sizable loans that Mr. Murdaugh had with Palmetto State Bank that were constantly in danger of going into default. We see a payment for $104,000 on Moselle. We see payments on Redbeard and Zero United. And so again, that money was necessary. Mr. Murdaugh needed to get that money in there, needed to get that money so that he could pay those loans that he had outstanding and stay one step ahead of the game, stay on what I've called an exhausting hamster wheel to stop that thing from coming off the rails. Because the second it comes off the rails, then somebody comes looking and all of this falls apart. And one way that could have happened is if he ultimately were to default on all these loans that he had with Palmetto State Bank. Because if that were to happen, then the bank, no matter how long this relationship had been, is going to be looking at what's been going on here. And so ultimately it was very crucial to get this money in and pay on those particular loans. All right, going in order here, Your Honor, I'm going to come back to the Satterfields. I'm going to hand out what's been marked as States 15. And Your Honor, this was the case of the estate of Blondell Gary. And in this particular instance, and had testimony had passed, and she met with Mr. Murdaugh a week later, and he ultimately settled the case without talking to her. And ultimately, there was some money that was being withheld to determine whether or not another individual was an appropriate beneficiary under this particular case. And that was why it was explained to them that they were withholding this money, but instead of Mr. Murdaugh doing what he said he was going to do, when he was able to withhold that money, he was able then to get it converted to a fake forged check. And we can see on the last page, we can see that forged structure. It says $112,500. And again, and Ms. Gary is sitting there. She's being explained that's why that money is being withheld, but ultimately Mr. Murdaugh was able to convert it to his own use. And again, he had a lot of that to go for his own expenses, for his own cash. Money went to Curtis Eddie Smith. Sizable portions of it went there, as well as a myriad of personal expenses that you can see on the first page of that tracing exhibit. Your Honor, for that particular crime, he's pleading to 2021 GS 4733, count 2, money laundering, $100,000 or more, for which he has agreed to a 20-year sentence. State's Exhibit 16. This is the big one, Your Honor. This is the check from the big recovery that Alex Murdaugh, in collusion with Corey Fleming, were able to get in the Satterfield case. And ultimately, after Mr. Fleming took his sizable legal fees, had a check cut from the Moss Coon and Fleming trust account for $2,961,931.95 and made out to the single word forge, and then had that personally delivered to Alex Murdaugh, who then was able to convert every dime of that money for his own personal use. And again, throughout all of that, and so all of this came to light till after the side of the road and people started looking, ultimately the Satterfields had never saw one thin dime of that money. They never received one thin dime of the money that went through Corey Fleming, that went through Alex Murdaugh. And it was all converted for his personal use, this particular check. Your Honor, for that particular crime, he's pleading, again, 2021 GS 4730, count 5 to money laundering, $100,000 or more. That's a 20-year sentence, and that will be the lead sentence for the case. I will get to later the additional 7 consecutive years. That's the other lead sentence that will total that 27 years of 85% time. But this 2.9, by far being the biggest amount, is one of the lead sentences in the particular case. And again, you can see how this money and the extensive amount of work that was done that was to trace how that money ultimately was spent. But just to give some examples, we have a payment of, look on page 2, Your Honor, a payment on of over $609,000 on a loan on which his father was a co-signer at the bank. We see a $500,000 payment on a loan relating to Moselle. We see over $132,000 going to C.E. Smith. We see repayments to one of his law partners of over $304,000. We see payments to his father for a loan for $385,000. We also see payments on a credit card down at the bottom there of $146,968.06. So again, stealing this money, we're getting to a critical point for Mr. Murdaugh. Stealing this money was necessary, again, to keep afloat and to pay back all these extensive loans that he had taken from the bank, to pay back these loans he had taken from his father, to pay back these loans he had taken from his law partners, to pay back six-figure credit card balances, as well as all the other expenditures that are listed on there. Next one I'll hand up to your honors is State 17. And the victim in this particular case is Christopher Anderson. And your honor, he's pleading to 2021 GS 4734 count 2, money laundering $100,000 or more, to which he's agreed to a 20-year sentence. And ultimately, in this particular case, he was able to convert through a disbursement statement that just said settlement proceeds to Forge $750,000. And once he had that amount made out to Forge, and again this check was on February 20th, 2020, he was then able to convert this money to his own personal use. And you can see the tracing exhibit on the front, all the personal expenses that were being paid through that money, a lot of online withdrawals and banking transfers, but also payments to Palmetto State Bank loans for over $104,000, a lot of money going to Curtis Eddie Smith, and then just general other personal expenditures. Next one I'll hand up is States 18. And this is the final Satterfield check, Your Honor. Again, over a year has gone by from the $2.9 million check, from that $3.8 million settlement. Again, the Satterfield family is unaware that a single dime has been recovered. And ultimately, there's still money remaining in the Moss, Kuhn, and Fleming trust account. And so Alex Murdaugh, in October again of 2020, has a check cut by Corey Fleming from the Moss, Kuhn, and Fleming trust account for $118,000 made out to just the single word Forge and delivered to him, which he then converts to his own use. You can see cash withdrawals of over $22,000. You can see over $28,000 to Eddie Smith, as well as other expenditures. And this, of course, is around the time also that they then have the stipulation of dismissal signed in the Satterfield case that doesn't have the caption. They do not advise the attorneys for either Nautilus or the prior insurance companies. Instead, Corey Fleming signs it, and he has Alex Murdaugh, the defendant, not the defense attorney, but the defendant himself, sign that stipulation dismissal in conjunction with having this forged check cut to Mr. Murdaugh for $118,000. Your Honor, that is 2021 GS 4730 count 8, to which he's also pleading to money laundering $100,000 or more and agreeing to a 20-year sentence. Next one is States 19. This is the estate of Sandra Taylor. This one really gets to me, and her mother, Elise Mallory, testified. Her daughter was killed by a drunk driver, leaving behind 3 minor children. And I've talked to her extensively. And she went to Mr. Murdaugh because she heard he was the best in town. And he kept telling her and lowering over and over again how much the case was worth. And if there ever was a more acute example of trust, it was Miss Mallory and Mr. Murdaugh. She put this case in his hands, and he kept coming back and saying that the case was worth less and less and less, until eventually he told her that the case was only going to be worth $30,000, $10,000 for each one of those children. And she believed him. Because like many people, $30,000 is a lot of money. The reality is that Mr. Murdaugh, with his insatiable need for cash, settled that case for $183,528 because he needed the money. And then he had a disbursement sheet that wasn't signed by Miss Mallory, executed, in which he put on their attorney's fees of $30,000. You can see that on the last page. And then had the rest of the money, $152,866, made out to Forge, and then converted that money to his own benefit. And that was on November 30th, 2020. $23,500 of that was cash withdrawals for his benefit. $29,000 went to C.E. Smith, and then more went to other versions of that name. Paid $20,000 on a credit card. And Miss Mallory, those children, like the Satterfields, who were also the most prime example of trust in this case, the people that trusted him more than anyone, the Satterfields and Miss Mallory, like the Satterfields, she didn't get one thin dime of that money. And Mr. Murdaugh even went so far as to go back to the firm and say, hey, I feel bad that I wasn't able to get that much from Miss Mallory. Can we refund the $30,000 to her? Because he told her that. He said, I can only get $30,000 in this case, and because, out of the goodness of my heart, I'm not going to take a legal fee. That's what he told her. Out of the goodness of my heart, I'm not going to take a legal fee. I'm just going to get you that $30,000. But the problem was he'd already dispersed the money. He'd already dispersed the $30,000 to the firm. And he went back to the firm and said, and telling them a different lie, telling them, hey, I would like to just refund that $30,000. I don't want to take a fee. Just refund that to her. Obviously what he was going to do was then give her that $30,000, which is what he had promised her was going to be the recovery all along. But the firm was like, no, the fees are paid. No, we're not doing that. And so Miss Mallory never got one dime. For that crime, Mr. Murdaugh is pleading to 2021 GS 4738, count 2, money laundering, $100,000 or more. And he is agreeing to that, to a 7-year sentence that is consecutive to the 20-year sentence of 2021 GS 4730, count 5. And those would, again, be the lead sentences for the total of 27 years at 85% time as a result of this plea here today. Your Honor, our next exhibit, Exhibit 20. In this particular instance, this was another instance in which Mr. Murdaugh was able to steal fees from the firm. This particular matter, he represented the individual, and ultimately he had cut 2 disbursement sheets. Number one, at the very last page of this exhibit in the disbursement sheet, he had the MPED attorney's fee, and then in parentheses the word forge for $83,333.33. Your Honor, that was from May 12th, 2021. And that particular fee made out to forge instead of going into the firm as it should. It was made out to fake forge, and Alec, again, was able to convert that money to his own use, cash withdrawals, payments to associates, the standard things that we see. He also had a second disbursement sheet cut in which it said forge on it, $91,867.50. That check was cut on December 16th, 2020. And again, ultimately, those were cut from the client trust account. Should have represented legal fees, but instead were diverted by Mr. Murdaugh into his forge account and converted to his personal use. And it's that last sheet, Your Honor, that where it says attorney's fees forge, that along with one of the ones I'm about to talk about next, the Ferris matter, or the matter involving Chris Wilson, those were 2 of the things that the firm had started to notice as everything started to come apart. And Your Honor, of course, has heard about the confrontation, the discussions between Jeannie Seckinger and Annette Griswold and Mr. Murdaugh about where the Ferris fees were. But the other thing that had caught staff's attention, that had caught Jeannie Seckinger's attention, was this Hirschberger matter and whether or not some fees had been diverted there. And it was not until months after the murders that a couple of things happened at the same time. The firm, Jeannie Seckinger, was looking back at this Hirschberger matter, concerned about what that was. Around that same time, Annette Griswold found the actual Ferris check that had been made out to Mr. Murdaugh instead of the firm. And what I'm going to talk about here in a minute, Thomas Moore, they started to look around, and that led them to identify the initial fake forge matters that led to them confronting Alec, terminating him, announcing that he had been stealing money, to which he's admitting today. And of course, the side of the road followed not long after that. Your Honor, for that, the Hirschberger matter, he's pleading to 2022 GS 4724 count 3, false pretenses, and agreeing to a 10-year sentence. Next exhibit I will hand up is Exhibit 21. Your Honor, this one is the matter involving Thomas Moore. In this instance, he was representing Mr. Moore, who had been injured in a wreck. Mr. Moore is a trooper who had been injured in the line of duty. Ultimately, Mr. Murdaugh had arranged for a recovery, did not advise Mr. Moore, did not tell him money had come in, and had a disbursement sheet cut for $125,000, you can see on the last page. Ultimately forged Mr. Moore's signature on there, and then had that dispersed to fake forge. This was on January 29th, 2021. And ultimately, you can see on the first page how a lot of that money was being dispersed, including to cash withdrawals, various iterations of the name Eddie Smith, the cash services business for $14,000, and other matters as well. For that, Your Honor, he's pleading to 2021 GS 4727 count 2, money laundering, 20 years or more. Again, all of these 20-year money launderings are 85% offenses, and ultimately he's pleading guilty to that one as well. Next hand up, State's Exhibit 22. Your Honor, this is the matter involving Chris Wilson. And as Your Honor will recall, Mr. Murdaugh had split this case with his friend Chris Wilson and another attorney. They had tried the case in, I believe, December of 2020, and bench tried it and had received a sizable recovery in the early months of 2021. Mr. Murdaugh, again, was in a desperate position needing cash and could not have these fees go into the firm because, again, the way the firm payment structure worked would be that he would not receive the majority of that money until the end of 2021 when the firm paid its overhead, settled up on its agreement, and then split up the remaining monies based on each attorney's individual contribution to that year's revenue. And ultimately, he had, on March 10th, 2021, a check cut for $192,000, March 23rd, 2021, $375,000, and April 20th, 2021 for $225,000, and had those all made out from the Chris Wilson's trust account representing the fees that should have gone to the firm, and had those made out to him personally and deposited it and spent for his own personal use. And it was those particular checks that led to, when the expenses came in, led to the whole inquiry from the firm, PMPED, back to Chris Wilson's office on where are the fees? Where are the fees? We got the expense check. And Your Honor, of course, has heard testimony about that issue percolating and the fact that it was even discussed on June 7th, 2021. And after June 7th, 2021, of course, no one was really paying attention to those matters anymore for a number of months. And one of the things that Mr. Murdaugh was able to do was borrow money from a law partner, and was able to borrow money from the bank, and got $600,000 and sent that back to Chris Wilson, and then told Chris Wilson a lie. Pretty much said, hey, I've got some things moving around. I'm going to send you the $600 right now. I'll get you the $192. But can you go ahead and tell the firm that all that money is in your trust account, which would solve the problem, because then that would stop the inquiry. And so ultimately that happened. Chris Wilson sent an email and said, those monies are in my trust account. And when, of course, everything crashed and burned following Labor Day of 2021, Mr. Wilson confronted Mr. Murdaugh, and Mr. Murdaugh admitted that he had been stealing and admitted that he didn't have that $192,000. And ultimately, those were the basis for the indictments in 2021 GS 4728, counts 1, which represents the diversion of the fees from the firm of $792,000, pleading to false pretenses on that for a 10-year sentence, and then count 7 representing that 192, not to double count it, but representing the 192 that he defrauded his friend Chris Wilson out of, and that's false pretenses to which he's agreeing to a 10-year sentence. Your Honor, additionally, Mr. Murdaugh is pleading to 2022 GS 4710, count 1, and that is a criminal conspiracy, Your Honor, between him and Curtis Eddie Smith. And the dates are from October 2013 through February 2021, and ultimately those deal with the conversion of a lot of these funds from whatever source through checks to Curtis Eddie Smith that related to a lot of illegal purposes, including narcotics. That total being at least $2,413,754.79. Finally, Your Honor, Mr. Murdaugh is pleading to 2022 GS 4734 count 9, and that represents his willful evasion of taxes for all of this ill-gotten gains, and that total from all those years is $619,391. Those are the crimes to which he's pleading here today, and the result of the exhaustive investigation that's been done here. And Your Honor, there were 101 offenses. And people might say, why are we resolving this in this manner? And the reason for that, there are a lot of reasons for that. Ultimately, we're having here a guilty plea in which Mr. Murdaugh is admitting his guilt, and we have gone and been able to detail the manner in which the system was abused. Mr. Murdaugh is waiving his appellate rights, and within the law, his post-conviction rights, which means for this plea here today, there is certainty, as much as the law will allow, that he will serve at least 85% of that 27-year sentence if Your Honor ultimately accepts this result. Whatever happens with any other litigation, we ensure with this result here today that Mr. Murdaugh will stay in state prison for what is most likely the remainder of his life. And that's aside from the 2 life sentences that Your Honor previously imposed upon him. But we have to remember that this result here today is not for the murders. This result here today is for those white-collar offenses. And 27 years at 85%, Your Honor, is more than anyone can think of, state or federal, that someone has received for white-collar offenses. It's more than Enron. It's more than WorldCom. It's more than Carolina Investors. It represents a singular accountability for white-collar offenses, the likes of which no one can find another example, state or federal, throughout the country. It spares a lot of these smaller counties what Colleton County already had to endure, and that is the expense in some of these smaller counties with less resources of these trials. It spares these victims those trials and gives them accountability here today, and means that ultimately we can be assured that there is an accountability for Mr. Murdaugh solely for the white collar, unlike anything anyone has seen. And we can be assured that he's not leaving state prison. He's staying in South Carolina State Prison where he belongs, because these were South Carolina crimes committed in South Carolina courtrooms just like this one here, and South Carolina state court actions before South Carolina judges just like you, Your Honor. Those are some of the reasons why this is a unique result. an appropriate result. Because although Mr. Murdaugh is facing an accountability just for white-collar offenses, unlike perhaps anyone ever, the course of conduct that we've identified through all of those exhibits, lasting for all that time period, involving so many victims, in amounts that may have been insignificant to him but were massive to them, the wreckage that he has left through the legal system, the distrust of the legal system that he has caused, deserve a singular accountability more than anyone has ever heard of. And that is why this sentence is appropriate. Ultimately, the firm, PMPED, who I mentioned, has been very cooperative with this investigation. The bank has been very cooperative with this investigation. And we've indicted, in investigating this case, we've indicted the individuals that the grand jury found probable cause that there was criminality, which is a different thing from civil liability. And Your Honor knows there's all kinds of civil actions and civil matters that still remain associated with the wreckage and the morass that this man has caused. And that is not, all of that is not for this courtroom here today. This is to resolve criminality. And ultimately, the firm has paid net amounts back to the victims that I've discussed here today. And that is not to say that those victims may still have claims outstanding. It is only to say that they have paid back net amounts. And in many instances, that would be the exact amount that Alex stole from them. Not dealing with other issues that may be out there, like the loss of the money for all that period of time, or the appropriateness of attorney's fees, or things like that. Those are for a different forum. The firm has, though, cooperated. The firm has paid those net amounts back to those victims so that none of them are currently empty-handed. Doesn't mean that anyone was ever made whole by what this man has done, because I don't know that that's possible. Ultimately, Your Honor, I want to hand up a couple more exhibits. Your Honor, this is simply a sheet that has been provided by the law firm, going through a number of those victims, monies that they have paid, those net amounts, other costs to them. And again, this is not to settle on a restitutionary figure. This is just to give Your Honor an example of some of the expenditures that are out there. And I've discussed this with the defense. I'm giving these figures up to Your Honor, but assuming that this plea gets accepted here today, our plan is to ultimately work with the defense and with all the various parties to come up with a figure that is appropriate for a restitutionary amount, even though we all know that in the end, the well is dry, and the well was bled dry by this man. This next exhibit details the tax liability and the amounts I identified before, representing the loss to the state of South Carolina for the tax revenue. This next exhibit, which was an exhibit at the murder trial as well, Exhibit 25, represents the confession of judgment to the Satterfields for $4,305,000. And the final two exhibits are sort of summaries of some of that related to the criminality in this courtroom today. And again, I want to be clear, the criminality in this courtroom today is to address the victims for which there were indictments and not to address all the claims that may be out there, all the claims that some of these victims may have, all the claims that the parties may have with each other. That's not the purpose of a criminal proceeding, but this is an effort for today's purposes, for acceptance of this plea, for exposure to the world of the extent of damage wrought by Alex Murdaugh, to put some numbers on it. And if we look at that first example, if we look at those various factors that I've identified, we see a total of $12,425,254.32. There have been some offsetting claims as it relates to the firm, and if you account for those, we're looking at $8,548,488.26. To say numbers like that out loud, to detail these involved schemes for this period of time, is unique and unprecedented and calls for a unique and unprecedented sentence of 27 years. Your Honor, I do have a number of victims and their representatives who would like to speak, and I believe our first one would be Eric Bland. I believe the mic right there is working, and this time I would, with the court's permission, allow these victims to address the court.
Prior to proceeding, we will take a 10-minute recess.